So let's go into our program. It's my honor to introduce Charlie Cote. Charlie and I first met 18 years ago when he joined a consultation group of therapists I was a part of. For 10 years, we discussed cases, formulated ideas, and supported one another in our professional work. But more significantly, Charlie became a great friend of mine and Nancy's, and golf partner with a big easy swing. And I have here 12 handicap, and I just found out today, it's now under 11, 10.8, 10.6, 10.6, gotta get that right. I got to know someone who's not only a talented therapist and golfer, but also, as you'll find out, a published poet. With over 30 years of clinical experience, Charlie is dedicated to helping individuals reconstruct their worlds by fostering understanding, growth, and healing through creative and expressive arts. As a therapist who integrates evidence-based practices like acceptance and commitment, therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and mindfulness, he creates a safe space for individuals to explore their experiences and overcome obstacles. His passion for poetry, golf, and mentoring the next generation of therapists adds a unique dimension to his work, blending therapeutic insight with creative expression. An accomplished poet, Charlie is the author of the books Flying for the Window and I Play His Red Guitar, using poetry as a medium for personal transformation. He is also deeply committed to professional growth and leadership, serving as a board member of 1330 Cancer Connect, president of the Society for Descriptive Psychology, and a founding member of ROC ACT, a community promoting acceptance and commitment therapy in Rochester, New York. So since we're talking about reconstructing worlds, it's a lot like his golf game. Here he is in one of his published poems, trying to work out his own motivations and his ultimate satisfactions, praying for significance, standing over a tricky 4-foot putt to win a match against yours truly. Before we get to the poem, just won't be a minute. So I quote from his poem. As he's picture him standing over this putt. Why not pray for tsunami victims? Pay to replace the 10 ripped off shacks by the rails. Or books for the poor kids need, less than what it costs to miss these putts each week. Maybe I should buy sorry.
That's how I felt when I was writing it. That's stuck a lot.
Yeah. I'm gonna start that over again. Here's the form again. Why not pray for tsunami victims? Pay to replace the 10 ripped off shacks by the rails. Or books the poor kids need, less than what it costs to miss these putts each week. Maybe I should buy my wife some flowers on the way home, my dog a bone. Lord, I accept the way he set down before me. He steps up to the ball and lets it roll. And just when you think you've mastered the game of life hands you a whole new course with even more hazards. But as in golf, it's not about avoiding the traps. It's about learning how to swing through them with grace. So Charlie, let it roll, brother.
Right. Wow.
What's going on? Here it is.
Wow. It's kind of fun to hear your words read out loud by somebody else. Because when you write poetry, if you really are serious about it, you're not just writing your own life, you're writing a reader's life. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. I'll try to speak up. You're not just writing your own life, you're writing the reader's life. If it's gonna mean something. I mean, anybody can do journal writing, but poetry hopefully has a public aspect to it. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But I just want to say what a privilege it's been for me to be part of this organization, this society. I remember back in 2018, I think it was the first online when we did during the pandemic. And Charlie's been bothering me to be part of the society for years, and I've been dragging my heels. And that gave me the motivation to join up, and it's been great ever since, and I've learned so many things. I think back to the presentation I made a couple of years ago, and I'm kind of embarrassed by it. I guess if you're a poet, you talk about your juvenilia phase, and that was sort of my juvenilia phase where I didn't really know much. I was pretty naive, but I just have been deepening my interest in descriptive, and hopefully tonight you'll see a little bit of a difference, how I'm integrating it into my own life, my own practice. So we're going to talk about reconstructing worlds through expressive arts, and in particular, we're going to talk about catastrophic loss. And I'm going to use as an example of catastrophic loss my own. And interestingly enough, Ray and I were just talking about this. I asked, what publication he had written about world reconstruction, and it was the American Journal of Psychotherapy. But what's really significant about it is he wrote that or published it in 2005, and that was the year my son died. So it's pretty interesting that that was really the main text that I'm sort of like drawing from for this presentation. So Ray, while you were writing that, I was my world was falling apart. My son was diagnosed with cancer when he was 16 years old, but we were shocked by this because 2 years before, when he was 14, we discovered a mole on his head. And we were told it was benign. So, the surgeons took margins, clean margins. And the only thing that I was bothered by is that he would have a permanent bald spot on his head. He had a beautiful head of hair. That was the only thing that bothered me about it. And it seems very trivial now. But then a year and a half later, he had a lump behind his ear. And we thought it was because he was sick with a cold. We thought it would go away. And then we went to see a surgeon who took the mole off his head. He thought it was just a sebaceous cyst. That's all it was. It was no big deal. And then when he got into taking it out, he found out it was a lymph node. And then that was that ominous first bit of news. Fast forward, we're on vacation in Boston, and we get a call from the chief oncologist at Strong Memorial Hospital saying he wants to meet with us, which is not a good sign to get a call from a chief oncologist saying, I'd like to schedule a meeting with you while you're on vacation. And then from there, it just got progressively worse. He ended up having melanoma. It was stage 4. And I'll tell more about the story later, but that's the context for this conversation that we're going to have. And the thing I want to say to you is, this is like a rough draft. And I'm asking you to collaborate with me on this. So I'll have some ideas, things that I'm working out, but you all might have a lot to say about it too. So there might be points where I'm just going to stop the presentation, and then we'll just have just maybe a round robin and some discussion if you're okay with that. Okay. You all know a lot more about this than I do. You know a lot more about reconstructing a world, but you may not know more about losing a child. I don't know if anybody here has. I know, there are people here who have had terrible, terrible losses. And a dear friend of mine said, when you have a loss like this, if you haven't been through it, nothing can be said. If you have been through it, nothing need be said. So there's something about, the companionship and the community of people who have gone through this has been part of my own reconstruction story, if you will, of finding people that, that I could find solace and support from. So anyway, moving on. So you're all familiar, I would imagine, with some of these concepts, foundational concepts in descriptive psychology, concepts like behavior potential, deliberate action, intentional action, person characteristics, social practices, but mostly we're going to be focusing on worlds and status dynamics. When a world gets disrupted, that is when reconstruction needs to happen.
Do you want the slides up?
Yes, could you put them up? Sure, thank you. I had the clicker.
Make sure it's on.
I was joking around with the board earlier today saying I only had 15 minutes of material, so I need to talk really slow.
We'll get this worked out.
There should be like a presentation button somewhere. We've been having lots of technical challenges today, so I think there's a technology gremlin in the room, so. Does anybody have any sage? Yay,
Yay.
all right,
Yeah, this will help use up some of your time too.
that's right. So let's talk about poetry or creative endeavors. I'm gonna focus mostly on poetry because it's an art that I've practiced and practiced very seriously and intentionally as a result of my son's death. It, for me, has been a unique avenue for emotional healing. It's enabled me to express and process very complex feelings of grief and trauma. And I've been very blessed to be influenced by some pretty well-known poets in this country. I've had a chance to study with them, people like Gregory and Thomas Lux, and some of you may or may not know those names. Stephen Dobbins, you know, some really amazing people who have taught me so many things about poetry. When you practice any craft, the deeper you go into the craft, the sturdier your craft, the more you can explore your world and go out to the edges of your world. So that's been my experience. It's been amazing. Wallace Stevens has been an inspiration to me. Last year, Jody and I were talking about Wallace Stevens, and we still need to have that conversation. So we'll start that tonight, because I'm gonna share Wallace Stevens' poem. And Gregory who's been probably the biggest influence on the way I write poetry, also is somebody who has experienced serious trauma. So we'll talk about that as well. So Wallace Stevens,
Just click it,
yeah.
and you'll have to turn it on.
Do I have to click it there?
No,
It's not working.
Charlie,
Be sure it's on.
make sure it's turned on.
It's on.
All right,
Can you just move it forward? One more. Okay, so poetry is a way to process grief and trauma. Poetry is survival. The next slide, please. The next one. Here we go. Wallace Stevens, anecdote of the jar. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground and tall and of a port of air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. So Ned and I were talking about, what is this poem really about? Ned, you said there was controversy about it, right? You said you studied some Wallace Stevens in your past, and what was the controversy?
Some people thought that the poem was reflecting the Tennessee Valley Association,
Yeah, so
which it is not.
probably not. So here's my take on it. So this poem explores the relationship between art and the natural world, suggesting that art can impose order on the chaos of life. In the poem, the speaker places a jar on a hill in Tennessee, and through the simple act, the surrounding wilderness seems to organize itself around the jar. The jar's presence makes the landscape appear more orderly, structured, and contained. Stevens uses the jar as a symbol of art's capacity to give shape and meaning to the disorderly and vast natural world. We were just talking, Lori, weren't we, about how you think life is going to go a certain way, and it always seems to find, chaos always seems to find us somehow, in all different degrees. The wilderness is described as sprawled and slovenly before the jar is placed, but once the jar is set on the hill, it took dominion everywhere. This reflects how art, even something as simple as human-made as a jar, can impose form and structure on the untamed, chaotic forces of life. However, Stevens also emphasizes the limitations of art. So, when you reconstruct a world, there are ways you can do it, and there are limitations probably to what you can do. And we'll talk about that later in terms of reality constraints, if you will. The jar creates order, but it's gray and bare, and doesn't fully engage with the vitality of the natural world. So it's a container, it's a tool, but it's not life itself. It's static and lifeless compared to the lush, dynamic wilderness around it. This could be interpreted as the acknowledgement that while art can impose form, it can't fully capture or replace the inherent complexities and richness of life. So I found this to be true too, that writing poetry helps contain the grief, helps me reflect on the grief, but I still have other aspects of life to do and have to find ways to find a viable, meaningful way to participate in my world after such a devastating loss. When you have such a devastating loss, what happens? You lose your place in the world. You lose a significant place in the world. And poetry for me was a way of reflecting deeply on what really matters. When I think about grief recovery, I don't think so much about making meaning out of his death, but more I think about making meaning out of the life that I shared with him. And now what? Now what's going to happen? What kind of life am I going to live now? Because I have choices about how to live my life. And the progression that I went through was not, wasn't all straightforward. There were a lot of setbacks, a lot of problems. I lived in a very problematic world after my son died, and even while he was sick. And there were ways that I was coping with that weren't so great. My behavior potential was not necessarily enhanced. It was probably harmed. I probably aged a lot faster. I know that I went gray very fast because of that experience. And a number of other things, but I'll talk about that later. Talking about the place that I found myself in, and then the journey that I've had to move out of that place into a new place, one that's more meaningful and I hope honoring to my son and to my family and to the people that I work with. So let's talk about Gregory Orr. This isn't working, so let me just forward it to you. Some part of the lyric wants to exclude the world with all its chaos and grief, and so conceives shapes, a tear, a globe of dew, whose cool symmetries create a mood of security, which is something all need. And so the lyrics urge to exclude what hurts. What hurts us isn't simply a crude defense, but an embracing of a few essential shapes, a tear, a globe of dew. But to what end? Are there clues in these forms to deeper mysteries that no good poem should exclude? What can a stripped art reveal? Is a nude more naked than the eye can see? Can a tear freed of salt be a globe of dew? And most of all, is it something we can use? Yes, but only as long as its beauty, like that of a tear or a globe of dew, reflects the world it meant to exclude. So Greg Orr's theory of lyric poetry is one where he, like Wallace Stevens, says it's like a container or a crucible for chaotic energies. And by the act of making art out of our grief and chaos somehow tames it or makes it more bearable. So we talk a lot about world reconstruction, moving from an unbearable world to a bearable world, or an unthinkable world to a thinkable world. And in some ways, the practice of art like this can help us make that movement, make that transition. Some key elements in Orr's theory, which he expounds upon in his book, Poetry is Survival. By the way, Gregory Orr, when he was 10 years old, went on a hunting trip with his brother. His mother said, "You have to take the other kids too," which is a no-no in hunting. And during this hunting trip, he and his father saw a buck. He got buck fever. He didn't turn the safety off. And he thought he shot, his father shot simultaneously. And then his father said he needed to turn the safety off or on. He did. And then he slung the gun over his shoulder and it went off and killed his younger brother. And then he lived in hell from that point on. In fact, he's written beautifully about it in a book called The Blessing, one of the most beautiful memoirs I've ever read. He talks about the blessing, and the word blessé or blesser means, one meaning is in French, it means to shed blood. And so he found meaning in the shedding of blood, but the journey that he went through was a massive world reconstruction. And the book really illustrates this beautifully. And, you know, for a period of time, he identified with the Cain and Abel story. He saw himself as Cain in the family. Nobody talked about it. They would not talk about his loss. And so he had no comfort. He thought he was Cain and he killed his brother. And then it wasn't until he got into high school that he discovered poetry. And that was the beginning of his journey towards Reconstruction. But he still had problematic things that were going on. He was part of the civil rights movement. And as a young college student, he went all by himself down into the South and put himself into harm's way when a lot of young people were being killed during the civil rights movement. He ended up being thrown in jail and was lucky to survive that. And so he talks about lyric poetry as a way of containing great chaos and making it more bearable. But he talks about lyric poetry as a containing form, with personal experience at the core. So it's the personal lyric, not just any lyric, it's the personal lyric. He talks about the power of language to transform the experience and a way to reconcile chaos and order and a kind of survival through creation, through a creative process. And in essence, Gregory Orr's theory suggests that lyric poetry provides a crucial mechanism for surviving and making sense of catastrophic loss. And I would say that is one way. I would say also that you have to have certain person characteristics to choose poetry as your vehicle for world reconstruction. Not everybody is going to want to be a poet. In fact, most people think being a poet is probably the worst curse that could happen to you. You know, it's a very hard art to practice. And I can't say that I'm really that good at it compared to the people who are masterful at it, but I will tell you that the practice of it, the studying of it has been very meaningful for me. And that's what we talk about in reconstruction, moving from something that feels meaningless and empty to something that has great value and satisfaction. And I would say I found that by practicing poetry. So I've told you a little bit about the story. I'll tell you a little bit more. After he got cancer, his first thought was, how can I be so sick when I feel no pain? His life didn't change dramatically after that, other than the fact that we had this feeling of dread hanging over us. We found out that he needed a certain kind of treatment. We didn't have the right kind of insurance for that. That treatment would have cost us $120,000 a month to get this treatment. Right? Thank God that I had a friend that owned a business and he said, why don't you come work for me, even part-time, and I'll qualify you for insurance. And so we were able to get the insurance that we needed, which was a godsend. But, you know, that treatment just made him feel sick. So now he's getting a treatment. Now he's really starting to feel sick. And the next step was to get radiation treatment. And then to get a radical neck dissection. He got cut from his ear all the way down through his parotid gland down here. And I remember walking into the hospital room right after the surgery. And I thought he was dead. It was gruesome. So this is the kind of degradation you experience. He was, in my opinion, a very beautiful young man, a very talented young man. He was a singer, songwriter. He was the front man for a popular band in our town. He was beloved by everybody. And he was beautiful. But then now he's all cut up and scarred, and he's got, you know, tumors that are starting to show up. And now he's got a permanent droop in his lip because of the surgery. And he's got dry mouth all the time. Then he gets radiation, half the hair falls off of his head. You know, and he's getting nauseous all the time. And it just got progressively more difficult. But I will say, to his credit, the more difficult it got for him, the deeper he became as a young person. So in some ways, this was the inspiration for my eventual reconstruction, because I was feeling so powerless and so guilty that he was going through this and I couldn't do anything about it, that I felt ashamed even. Like, you know, how could I let this happen to my son? I'm supposed to protect him. But he was gracious about it. The first day we went for the first meeting, he said, "You, mom and dad, you do whatever you have to do because I don't want you to ever have any regrets." He was 16 years old when he said that to us. Unbelievable. As it progressed, it got worse. We ended up down at the National Cancer Institute. He was part of a clinical trial there called cell replacement therapy, where they took cells out of his body and they found the ones that were most aggressive against the cancer. They reproduced millions of them and then they re-entered them in his body. But in order to re-enter him into his body, he had to be taken to what's called a neutropenic state, meaning his immune system went to zero. And that was dangerous. And it was gruesome. I mean, his heart rate was through the roof and his blood pressure was down really low. It was humiliating. And he was nauseated. He ended up having a psychotic episode after one of his anti-nausea medications, ended up going into ICU. It was a nightmare that we lived through. So this is what I'm trying to illustrate. When somebody has catastrophic loss of any kind, you are degraded. And you go from living in a possible, even a pleasant world, to a very problematic one, if not an impossible world where you feel like you have zero behavior potential. You like are almost like a zombie. When he, or just before he died, we were having a family retreat and his girlfriend was with us. And she was not fully accepting that he was going to die soon. And this was adding to the stress and the strain. And he was saying, "I need her to be okay. I need all of you to be okay. He wrote in his journal, where I'm going, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be okay." Because he had this really strong faith, this strong perspective. I asked him one time, I said, are you afraid to die? And he said, "No." I said, "What? What do you mean?" He said, "I'm just curious about what's next." It's like, okay. Which added to my shame. Because like he's going through all this pain and misery and I'm feeling sorry for myself, you know, it's just degrading, the whole thing. I can't do anything about it. At one point I told him, I said, "I wish we could go with you. I wish we could go with you." After he died, his girlfriend inherited his journal. He was a singer, songwriter, he was a poet himself. We found this one quote in his journal that became the title of my first book of poems, Flying for the Window. He wrote, certainty is the cage that keeps us safe from curiosity. I've been released from the cage. I am the songbird, and I'm flying for the window. I know it's closed, but I plan on breaking through. That's significant to me. That is profoundly significant to me because it encapsulates all the values that I'm trying to live my life by right now. To be curious, to break through, to persevere, to do something significant and meaningful, do something that honors, his way of life and, honors other people as well. So that's been part of my Reconstruction story. I'm sort of getting ahead of myself, but we'll just go with the flow here. I went into writing poetry because I wanted to find a way that I could continue the creative energies that he had committed himself to. And I said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it as passionately as he did it. And so I went a deep dive into poetry. And my subject became grief and loss. Some would say there's only really two subjects to most art, and it's loss or love. So I guess in some ways it was both, because it was the love that I have for him and also the loss. We would call that kind of poem elegiac or elegies. Elegies are both lament and celebration of the life. And so that became a very meaningful thing for me to do. I don't know how to go back here. What do I want to say about that? My journey to reconstruction of my own world was not always met with congratulations or joy in other people's worlds. And that's the other thing that's kind of different. So in some ways, when you have a catastrophic loss, you find out what really matters and what really fits for you. So part of my story, part of the recovery, and part of the ups and downs was that my marriage didn't survive it. So when I would want to write about this and make art out of loss and grief, his mom would feel like that was crushing her. And so it was more feelings of degradation and pain. So it was not a straight line. I will say that, she and I have done really well of maintaining a gracious relationship. So I'm really thankful for that. And I'm thankful for my two surviving kids who have been very gracious about it too. And we've all, tried to use my son, his name is also Charlie, as inspiration for that. That we didn't want to harbor bitterness or grudges or anything like that.
You need another slide.
Yes, please. Next one, please. So I want to share a poem. This is where I got the title for the book, I Play His Red Guitar. When my son was sick, and toward the end of his life, his aunt, my sister, bought him a red guitar. And my son willed that to me when he died. So I have his red guitar. But this poem sort of talks about the meaning of the red guitar in terms of, I'm going to say, as a symbol of reconstruction. It's called What I Wear. This world above worlds is a prairie of clouds and sun glare. Below, the smoldering hearths shed smoke like a radiated hair. Worth less than his breath on earth, his song plays in my ear. Still, I listen for clues, the gift of his verse. You see me wear this blue plaid shirt? I play his red guitar. I chose this poem because I think it illustrates a transition between worlds and the confusion that can happen. Like some people talk about the hero's journey, or like, you know, liminal space, like falling into chaos and then all the challenges, and then trying to find some kind of recovery or some kind of meaning in that, and then bring it back to the community. For me, you know, wearing the blue plaid shirt was a gift he gave me. And playing his red guitar, another gift that he gave me, is symbolic of trying to honor him, trying to embody some of the spirit or the values that he lived by. And so I wear this blue plaid shirt and I play his red guitar. So that poem right there sort of signifies too also the confusion that happens when you're in between worlds. I flew here on JetBlue. This poem was first written on a JetBlue plane, and that's where that imagery comes from. I'm up, you know, this world above worlds is a prairie, clouds, and sun glare. You're up there and it just, everything feels strange. And then everything also gets redefined by the trauma. So it isn't smoke coming out of a chimney, it's a radiated hair falling out. You know, so your whole world has changed, your language changes, everything changes. The significance changes, your place changes. The other thing that the poem also implies, somebody said, that poem seems like you're talking about heaven or something like that. And I was never consciously aware that that's what I was talking about. But I was thinking about like what happens when you die. Where do you go? I used to think I knew. One of the fallouts from his illness was losing my faith in some ways, losing my religion. And having to, you know, kind of rebuild my life all over again. Because the religion that I had, it gave me an anchor. Losing that anchor. You know, the confusion, and then the smoldering hearth is a bit of a pun. It's the smoldering heart. It's the pain in the heart, you know, his breath. So I'm glad that I have his songs to play, recordings of him singing, but it's worth less than him actually being here. I'd be glad if he never wrote any of those songs if he were still here, but I don't get that. That is not something that's accessible to me anymore, so I have his songs. And I hope that some of his singing sings through my own poetry. But it's not just his song now, it's my song too. And now it's not just my song or his song, but it's your song too. When you go through an experience like this, you can speak somebody else's grief and loss. I've had people say I cried all the way through the book. I saw my own losses in that book. Even though it wasn't specifically their loss, it just felt they knew, like what Robert Frost said, there's no tears in the writer, there's no tears in the reader. So, you know, there's something healing about it. I suppose we could say it's a kind of exposure therapy for those of you who sort of think in those terms, but it's probably more than that. Can we go to the next one? So when I first got into the field, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy was everything. That's what they teach you. It's like the gold standard, you know, if you want to change, you got to do cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm really not sort of on that bus anymore. But, right. I mean, not to say that there aren't some valuable pieces to it, but to me, it's become a very limited view. And, you know, the whole journey into descriptive has really opened me to a bigger frame, which I'm so grateful for. But there is a catharsis, some emotional expression that can lead to a change in perspective or a change in consciousness. Are you going to be talking about consciousness, Joe, this time?
Oh, very marginal.
Marginally, okay. I know you've talked a lot about it, written about it, right? And then in descriptive, it's not maybe what a lot of people think it is popularly. It's more conscious as or as a certain person in a certain place acting on the things that are real to you. That makes sense, or that is the case for you. Am I getting that right? Sort of?
As I can see.
Okay, all right. engaging in a creative process can enhance a person's self-concept and their identity, all things that are, pretty much related to cognitive behavioral therapy, but I think there's more to the story, and that's why I want to go on to world reconstruction. Can you go to the next slide? So the first exposure I got to relationship change formula, I think was, Joe, you did a talk on this with race relations, I think.
Yeah.
That was a couple years ago. And so the formula, as best I understand it, please correct me if I'm wrong. If P has a relationship to Q, and P does a different behavior with Q and B is consistent with S, but inconsistent with R, then R, the relationship moves in the direction of S. And now, I don't know if this is the case, but it seems logical to me that P is a person, R is a relationship, and maybe Q is the question at hand, but I don't know what the Q stands for. Does anybody know? I just can say it's the
I
question.
think it's, as I understand, it's generally used to refer to another person.
Another
But it
person,
could be something else.
it could be.
I'm looking at a certain relationship to this tangerine.
Right,
And I do something that's inconsistent with the relationship I've got right now.
Yeah.
It can change, the relationship between me.
so I guess it could be a world too.
Yeah,
right? So Q could be a world. So for me, the Q was grief. And I was avoiding it. That was my relationship to grief early on, avoidance. Are people calling in with concerns about?
No, yeah, there's just text or choose someone from my.
Okay.
So
So the relationship that I had to grief is that it was chaotic and ugly. And but my relationship to poetry was as a novice, just like my relationship to descriptive psychology was as a novice, and my relationship to grief, recovery, was as a novice. So then I have a different behavior with the question at hand, the loss. I write about it. I start writing about it. I fashion a container for it. I study and practice poetry. I'm doing something different now in relationship to grief and loss. I approach it. I don't avoid it. It becomes stabilizing and beautiful to me. I gain competence and I gain confidence. It doesn't overwhelm me as much as it did before. I start to face the loss. I make sense of it and I bear it. And I publish. I honor my beloved one. I honor my son. And I start to help others. To me, that's sort of like a way of illustrating status change, the beginnings of world reconstruction. Does that make sense? Am I on the right track?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, cool. Next slide. So this is where I lean really heavily on Ray's article that I mentioned earlier. And I made some more notes on it, so I'm gonna refer more to my notes because I feel like it helped me understand a little better, but as Ray paints the picture in his article, a world is a totality. It is all that is or could be. It is the case. It is all states of affairs. Okay, it's all the actual and possible objects, processes, events, and states of affairs. And when we look at it as therapists or as grievers or anybody, we can't take it all in. We only take the most relevant parts of it, the most accessible parts of it. We start to think about our place and we start to think about our eligibilities, what we can and can't do in the world. We start to put it in context. The context that we have for a thing tells us how we see the thing. I was looking at a poll on the debate, and it was not surprising that the majority of Democrats thought Kamala won, and the majority of Republicans thought Trump won. So that was no real big surprise, because the context that they are living in supports a certain view of the world and a certain way that the world makes sense, or they want it to make sense, so it wasn't a surprise. What Ray talks about in this article is that if our world is constructed over time, that's part of our developmental history, it's part of us becoming the person that we are uniquely, right? Our capacities are brought out by our relevant learning histories and experiences. But he said, if a world can be constructed, it can also be reconstructed. So the implication there, though, is a world can be destructed or deconstructed. And so I would say that the early story of loss and grief is a deconstructed world, or a degraded world, or the ruins of a world that have to be rebuilt. There's a difference between the real world, which is the totality of all things possible, versus a person's world. Am I getting that right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. What we take the case to be. But as Pete said, you can't just construct any old world, you have to have a world that is apt and correct in its descriptions. So I can't fly unaided, there's certain things I can't do. Although if I put those wingsuits on, I can fall with grace, like what's his name? On Toy Story. I'm not falling, I'm fine. No, you're falling with grace. A change in world is a change in personality. It's a way that we appraise things and then act accordingly. And when we develop that personality on an enduring basis. How does the personality change? Well, one way to change it is to destroy it or complicate it. You know, I mean, most people who come into therapy come in because their world has been degraded in some meaningful or significant way, and they're asking for help to rebuild their world. Personality, Ray talks about, is seeing the world in a certain way, enduringly, and behaving accordingly. So for me, grief became that problematic, impossible world. My behavior potential was restricted. It didn't go completely to zero, but it was restricted. And what do I have to do? I have to accept my loss, but there's a lot of resistance to that. And the thing that you wrote in this article, which was, I think, the new thing, was that there was a precondition for helping somebody deal with their denial or their avoidance, and it was helping them to envision a viable world without the presence of the deceased one. To imagine a thinkable world with expanded behavior potential, and not just about the loss. What else is going on in your life? What else is possible? Moving towards meaningful engagement and satisfaction. So his life, the story of his life: songwriter, musician, playful, adventurous, thoughtful, faithful, wise, deep, a poet. Story of my loss: powerlessness, numbing pain, guilt, dashed hope, futility, suffering, ripped off, vulnerable, at fault, disillusion. That's where I started. His legacy is live the best life you can live right now. Be creative. Cultivate creativity in your life, no matter what, right now. Alleviate the suffering of others. That is what I want now, my new world to look like. That is my credo now. The deconstructed world is one where faith dies, where community goes haywire. I don't know who my friends are anymore, where my marriage goes haywire, where my health declines, where my aging accelerates, where I become immobile, where I engage in unhealthy coping mechanisms. The reconstruction is poetry. It's creative art. It's doing something that honors his life. It's going to therapy. It's doing board service like this here with the society, with 1330 Cancer Connect. It's leadership training. It's studying a craft, increasing behavior potential, increasing competence. It's teaching, it's finding a path forward. A year and a half ago, I started a business called Path Forward Counseling. And the symbol for Path Forward Counseling is a dragonfly on a compass. The symbol that I have for my son is a dragonfly, because we live by a lake and dragonflies were everywhere, and it became the totem symbol of transformation and recovery. A dragonfly moves in its nymph phase from a waterborne life to an airborne life. And once it reaches that airborne life, it doesn't go back to the waterborne life. You'll see it on top of the water. And so there's like a myth of the dragonfly. You know, it's like a myth of like the transition from one state of being to another. So that's the symbol of Path Forward Counseling, is a dragonfly, but it's also a compass. Because the compass represents values, direction, meaning, what matters most. And so it's been, I would not be doing this if it wasn't for the relationship that I had with my son. I would not be doing it. I would just finish my solo practice. Right now, what I'm doing is creating a home for young therapists to develop their, you know, their world as therapists, and to provide support and caring for them, and sort of as a, hopefully an alternative to, you know, more degrading ways that they might get early experience. I don't know how many of you worked in, you know, really rough situations early in your career. You all have stories to tell. All right, I'm rambling now. So can you go to the next slide? What were we talking about? So as a client or as a therapist, we want to assess the client's world with empathy. We want to identify problematic aspects of the world, and then we want to help them with reconstruction. I think I've talked about some of those things. I'm just sort of using myself as the case study. Can we go to the next one? So we talked about this already. Change in status is a change in consciousness. A new status opens up new behavioral possibilities. A community and status reassignment statuses have this public aspect to it, which you helped me with, Charlie. So for me, being a poet, I stepped out into the public world as a poet. I didn't just do it. I mean, I joined a community of other poets and got validation and affirmation as a fellow artist, and that was very meaningful. Art forms like poetry help reconstruct statuses, not just individually, but in community. Grieving and status assignment. Grieving integrates loss into the world. The community validates the reconstructed status, and that's therapeutic. People say, I see you. That makes sense. I'm with you. Although early on, one of the things I hated hearing over and over again was, I can't imagine. I just can't imagine. I hated hearing that. It was like a rug burn. I can't imagine. Well, of course you can't. I don't want you to have to. Someday you will have your own catastrophic loss, but you know, that's not the most helpful thing to say. It's just not. It would be better to just say, how are you doing? Tell me about your son. Tell me about your life. Not, oh, I can't imagine. You know? It's like,
I was asking if you're okay.
yeah, yeah. Oh, you know, my mom might watch this sometime, so Mom, I love you. I not to feel too criticized by this, because I don't mean it as criticism. I just mean it as a funny story about my own reconstructed world with you. My mother, after I finished my first book of poetry, out of sincere concern for me, said, okay, no more Charlie poems now, right? You published that, you're gonna move on now, right? No more Charlie poems. The old me would have been furious with her. How dare you say such a thing? But because of the work that I had done and my son's graciousness now living in me, I could say, you're really worried about me, aren't you? You're really worried about me. And she started crying. So I knew I hit gold with that. She was worried about me. And I said, I feel really loved by that. In the past, I would have been furious with her. I said, I feel really loved by that. I said, I'll tell you what, Mom, I'll put in a word with muse for some new subject matter. How's that sound? Then I wrote the other book and it was all about the loss. But the cool thing was, after the book came out, I did two, readings, one at your house, which was lovely. They hosted a reading. And then I did a reading at my sister's house down in Georgia. And after I was done reading, my mom came up to me in tears and she said, I get it now. I get it now. My sister was funny though. Before she said, I have a lot of friends who are not into poetry, so could you not go on too long about it, please? And I said, no, I don't think they're into poetry. And I said, I think I know what you're saying. I got this. And after it was over, she came up to me in tears too. She said, I get it too. Yeah. So, the poetry, a lot of people don't really like poetry. They don't get poetry. But I don't know, this poetry, I think maybe has a certain embodiment to it, that it connects with other people. And I don't say that to brag, I say it to just out of gratitude, actually. Gratitude that I could express that. And that other people could experience or could hear it, that it could actually open up some real meaningful talk. Okay. So, can we go to the next one? Okay, so what are some status changes for me? So I'm thinking about place, practices, and potential. And I don't know if this is right or not, but this is what came to my mind. So what place did I have? I had the place of father. I had the place of a bereaved father now, and now I have a place as a poet. So these are new places that I can be in. I was a father before I was really a serious poet. But then this was the transitional, step that happened, which was hard. The practices, I was actively parenting this boy, this young man, right when he was getting ready to go off to college. He never got to go to college. I went into a period of grief and mourning. I started learning, I started creating, I started sharing. This was the practices that I started to engage in that helped with my reconstruction. And then the potential, I could share my life with him. We could share life together, meaningful things we could do. Well, that was taken away. I felt the degradation. I got degraded. I couldn't do that anymore. And not only that, I was left with all these really painful feelings. But then I could, through poetry, which was my avenue, I could heal, I could recover, and I could find meaning. And those were the status changes that helped with my reconstruction. And I think would probably help with other people's reconstructions, but maybe in different unique paths that would fit their person characteristics, that would make sense for them, and how we can help them as therapists and as friends. Can you do the next slide? Okay, so research that supports this, research strongly supports the therapeutic benefits of expressive arts. That studies demonstrate that art therapies can reduce depression and anxiety symptoms, improve cognitive function, and enhance quality of life. For instance, a 2021 study by DeWitt and colleagues highlighted art therapies effectiveness across various populations, while Dunphy et al. In 2019 emphasized their role in improving emotional regulation. These findings underscore the art's powerful role in healing and transformation. Next, please. So moving from theory to practice, like what do you do with this? But what do I do with this? Okay, so I have my own practice as an artist, but now what? What's the expansion? What's the expanding world? Well, for me, it's introducing other people to these kind of processes for the people that it would fit for. So one of the things we're doing at Path Forward Counseling is we're creating Path Forward Creative Wellness. And one of the things we just did, which I can't believe that this happened. I was on a radio show, a local radio show, with the chief oncologist at Strong Memorial Hospital, but not the one that my son worked with, his replacement. So we're doing a radio interview together on poetry, creative arts, And then, just helping adults, adolescents and young adults with cancer. Cause that's what 1330 is all about. She and I hit it off and she said, oh my gosh. I want you to come work with our staff and teach them mindfulness practices, art practices, because they're going through hell themselves. They're having all this secondary trauma. Would you please consider that? I said, oh, yeah, okay. I was scared. These are doctors. These are, they're at the highest level of their profession. Plus, they were my son's doctors. So I show up to the first meeting last Friday with a creative collaborator that I'm working with. Just willing. That's the only thing I can tell you, with a vision and a willingness. That's all that I had. And I walk in the room and I swear to you, the first person I see was my son's palliative care doctor. His name is David Coronas. And I'm like, oh my God. He was, of all the doctors we experienced, the most soulful, the most present doctor we had. Ironically, at the end of his life, when nothing else could be done, this was the man that worked with him. He came to our house on 2 occasions. What doctors do that anymore? He came to our house the first time to help his girlfriend's parents give her permission to not go back to school for a semester so she could be there. He was there, he was present. We asked him, how much more time do you think he has? And he was very gracious and very diplomatic. And that gave permission for their daughter to not go back to school. They were afraid she was going to get stuck in her grief and not move on. But she had to do that. She is now a doctor herself. She's married, she's got 2 kids, she's doing great. So she didn't miss a beat. He came to our house the second time, the night my son died. He sat with us for an hour and a half. And just sat with us. He didn't say anything, I just let us talk about our son and show videos and just cry with us. It was profound. And I'm walking into this room and he's there, and now I'm supposed to help him. And I'm just thinking, my son's probably laughing at this thing. Gotcha. But it was amazing. He said, I'm just so grateful that you're here. Because we need this. He said, we need to be more present. We need to be present to ourselves. We need to be present to our patients. We're in a culture of doing, constant trying to control things that we can't control. So that was really meaningful and profound. And it feels like the expansion of this world reconstruction that's been happening for me. And I feel really grateful to be part of it. Can you do the next one? I'm going to conclude with this, and then we can open it up for conversation. Yeah, so I am still a dad, and I like to tell puns. So the poetical or potential to foster resilience and transformation, personal and professional context, invitation to further exploration and discussion. So for me, I'm trying to incorporate the creative arts into healing and reconstruction with clients that we work with as a kind of aftercare model for their therapy once they go through their really intensive phase, but then to have a community or a place where they can find solace and support and explore art for those who would find that to be meaningful. And then also trying to help other practitioners of art do something where they can expand their world and give back to the community. So we're trying to build community and build compassion and do it through creative wellness. The act of writing helped me process my grief in a structured way. It's led to a noticeable shift in my outlook and my sense of renewed possibility in life. And I'm grateful. So that's really all I have. I want to open it up to discussion now, like what came up for you? How could I maybe make this clearer? What I miss? What are the other possibilities in helping people with reconstructing the world? So the floor is yours.
Before we get into that, Dan, are you able to watch the chat for people online to ask questions? Are you able to do
Yes.
that? Okay,
When has a question.
okay. Great, not a bad understanding. You're switch, well, it is switching cameras.
Can you hear me?
Hi, sure.
I'm not sure.
In Reconstruction, you know, poetry is a destructive force.
Okay,
That's what misery is, nothing to have it hard, is to have or nothing. You started with Wallace Stevens.
right.
That was his counterpoint to, with some irony to what you were saying, but it's entirely consistent because it involves what happens when you face misery, and the misery is nothing to have it hard. It's the starting point, a restarting point that you beautifully describe how to navigate.
I just want to say thanks. It's very.
Thank you.
Well, mentioned there's a 1985 an advances article by Mary Roberts called Worlds, I think it's called Worlds and World Reconstruction. So some of the things that you mentioned there, probably in the original, they were cited, but coming from her, so.
Okay. So we want to give props to
Yeah,
Mary.
so
I did
it's like a
read- I
world
did that.
is constructed and can be reconstructed, that
Yeah.
comes from Mary. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Mary. Rob.
I think
people have their worlds ripped apart and, sort of blasted into nothingness, a big piece of the experience is the unfamiliarness of it all, unfamiliarity, I guess. I think wrapping things around with the idea of sort of stranger in a strange land.
Yeah.
That part of your recovery process is familiarization, to, in most ways, it's the same world. There may be some various ways it's different, but you have to kind of re-familiarize yourself. I think people feeling things are apocalyptic, but I think using a language of deeply unfamiliar helps people regain and reconnect to the parts that are still there that you can use to rebuild and move down that road for recovery.
Yeah. I mean, maybe related to what Wynn said about poetry also being a destructive force is also the notion of the mimetic aspect of art, where it's mining life and maybe heightening one's awareness. Keats talks about a negative capability where you are able to not have an anxious reaching after fact, but you're willing to live in uncertainties. I'm paraphrasing that, but the idea of being willing to navigate an unfamiliar sky and find maybe even a home there. Ironically, the last album that his band put out was called Unfamiliar Sky. Yeah,
Everything's unfamiliar until you get familiar.
that's true.
Mourning death has some clear similarities to what happens to people when they've been excommunicated, especially from a tightly controlled cult. In contrast to excommunicated from a broader religious practice that they no longer have access to the community. And what seems to be one of the major factors about how reconstruction will occur will be whether or not what values they already have acquired that serve as a bridge to new social practices and to new community. That the essence is the person concept, one of the central features is community. And when you lose, a spouse, a child, an aspect of your own body, your membership in a community, you've lost a significant aspect of your ability to perform significantly in a world. And that healing involves that reconstruction that generally rests on a prior capacity, a prior set of values that allows for a bridge. To the extent that a person doesn't have that, the depressions tend not to be recovered. And you get a
So
lot of,
that's interesting, because I said I lost my faith, but in fact, probably a more accurate way to describe it was a refined faith. A faith that the parts of that faith that actually meant something and actually could survive, or if you think about like a refiner's fire. You know, putting like gold in a crucible and heating it up and then, you know, scraping off impurities, getting rid of, you know, the things that are not pure or not sound anymore, that just don't fit anymore. I guess you're talking about aesthetics, you know, talking about what is it that I really care about, because that's one of the things I did experience. All the things about maybe the cultish aspects of my religious experience just sort of died away. And the more solid values remain. And then transformed, if you will. Because I don't think I've lost my faith. I haven't lost my faith in humanity. I haven't lost my faith in the creative powers and all that kind of stuff. It just, I'm not part of that gang anymore. But I'm now free to actually connect with other people that are outside of that community, and that's been really enriching and meaningful to me. So, and I think poetry was one vehicle, but then there were others too, so. Rob?
When we shared a room at last year's conference, you showed me your drawing.
Yeah.
And I could see, you know, the cover of the red guitar book, and you know, I just think, you know, that's another avenue. You know, you talked about people finding their creative expression. Some people are poets, some people are visual artists. There's poetry and woodwork, you know, whatever it is, but getting people to draw that out. How did your visual art and your poetry integrate? I know the cover there is an example, but I found just the journal you shared so powerful and so evocative.
The drawing was a way of coping with the stress of the pandemic. I did a lot of doodling. Because I had a lot of anxiety about the pandemic and all the isolation that was happening and the uncertainty. And one of my clients introduced me to this practice called Zentangling, which is taking a fragment and recreating that fragment, repeating that fragment in a grid of sorts. And so that's where I started. I started playing around, and that practice started to deepen, and it became a mindfulness practice for me, a way that I could be present and a way that I could cope with stress and strain. So I think I'm getting more satisfaction out of that than writing poetry lately. Because it's very visceral and it's embodied, and there's a lot of color and a lot of shape and form, and I find it very meaningful. And so I want to incorporate that. I think probably what's going to happen is I'll probably start integrating the two at some point. But I don't know, for some reason I'm finding that I had this artist in me all along, that I never really paid a lot of attention to it until recently. And so that's what's been happening. I want to get into stained glass. I was telling Lori that. But
Just to comment on the last one. As I'm listening, you talk about the art, the drawing.
Yeah.
It struck me that you're describing some of this sounds like it's basically pure actor, as contrasted with when you're worrying, you're concerned, you're anxious about like the pandemic. That's observer and what can I do? Of course, you can't do a damn thing about the pandemic, except get vaccinated and restrict yourself, but that's not really dealing with the pandemic. This is it's a way for you to act rather than thinking about things or worrying about things or struggling with things.
And you talked about that last year about what is mindfulness practice, like what is meditation?
Yeah.
And that's actually had a big impact on me in terms of how I see this art practice as a way of observing whatever shows up without making negative appraisals about it,
Yeah,
right? And I actually have found that really helpful as a therapeutic tool with my clients to help them differentiate between appraisals and observations. And these creative practices are ways of anchoring in the present moment.
last year when I was working on that, I had a conversation with Walter Torres. And he talked about a book he had read, discussing the fact that we, in this culture, I'm not talking about others, live in a culture that is heavily critic oriented. People are all the time worrying about, did I do it right? Did I do it well? Did I do it as well as I could do? Did I do it as much as I could do? He cited the example of people worry about, am I having sex the right way? And the mindfulness, going along with what you said, what reminded me, is setting aside that critic functioning. Perhaps as a way, obviously you don't set aside critic functioning permanently, because you can't live like that. That's not being a person. But it's learning to keep it under control, keep learning to balance it with actor. Because after all, that's what it's supposed to be there for, is to help you get the actions right, rather than becoming the thing you do. It ties in very closely with what you just said.
I've another descriptive concept that's been really helpful for me is the actor, observer, critic.
Okay.
And the concept, I think maybe Charlie's talk helped me understand this. About, the super critic versus, criticism for the benefit of the actor. And,
Right.
so like with a lot of clients, we get into these conversations about self-criticism in particular, and of course, Ray's paper on criticism, also very helpful to, sort of form some of my thinking on this and give me another frame for myself, but also working with clients. How is this benefiting you? What is the benefit for you? And then all the other ways that you describe that in terms of, if I don't do it perfectly, then it's not enough, or I had to have known ahead of time, and, but you can only know that after the fact, but you tell yourself you should have known. So.
Carolyn Sager has a question.
Okay.
Oh. Yeah, one of the interesting things to me, as some of you know, within 1 year, I lost my brother, my sister, and my husband all to end-stage Parkinson's after prolonged, how it is with Parkinson's. I also, the day after we buried Paul, learned that I had yet another ultimately fatal disorder, that there was maybe nothing they could do at all, but if I at least tried something, if I didn't try something, I would certainly die soon. So you talk about worlds, your worlds being in ruins. And even now, I can barely follow what you're talking about conceptually. I was so traumatized. I was so ill. I was just trying to survive. And what I had to fall back on, I guess you might say, as pure actor, was just to follow my intuition about everything. I couldn't do anything that I saw that had been helpful to me in my life. I would just turn on the television. And I decided, I just picked this Holocaust documentary, one of the really gruesome ones, to watch. And I thought, well, this is bizarre. But I just had to trust what little I had left. And at the end of that first film, I said to myself, wow, I have had a terrible loss because I've had a terrific life. What they have is a tragedy. That's a tragedy for the whole world. I've simply had a terrible loss. I watched Holocaust films every night for about a week until that really stuck with me. And then I randomly picked something else, World War II battle scenes. That was really for my brother and Paul, because they grew up in that time and followed the war closely. And I imagined myself, what their world is so different. What role could I have in that world of fighting men? I decided I could have been a medic. And these things were amazingly affirming to me as I'm somebody who can go on. But I'm still at the point where I listen to what you say. I'm not sure I'm there yet, that I can deliberately, consciously think through, where am I? What am I doing? I did start doing some sketches in a notebook recently. It's just, every loss is in some way the same. Every loss is completely different. But the world destruction, plus everybody I know is dying, and I live with, 500 people. We're all here till we check out. To reconstruct my world at this point, I don't see I have any choice. I must. But I will have to look at your slides later to say, oh, right, well, yeah, I can imagine that. The length of time one can just be in survival mode when one is also ill themselves is amazing to me, that it's possible.
What is the maximum that if you're called upon to do a thing, but you can't do it, you'll do what you can do?
Yeah. Yeah, people would say to me, you know how to meditate. I said, I can't do any of those things, but I can turn on the television set.
That's right. You do what you can do.
No,
You go where
I
you're
can
welcome.
listen to
What I
books
left
during
out of
the
my
night.
story was,
Yeah.
Before my son died, just before, right towards the end, I went into a really obsessive phase. I was obsessed with his music and wanting to promote his music, like somehow that was going to keep him alive. And then after he died, I went into a manic phase where I couldn't sleep. I was wired.
Oh, yeah.
And I couldn't rest. And what I ended up doing was I took up knitting. It was the only thing I could do. I knit. I knit 40 scarves. I look like a fool. Like I let my beard grow really long. I lost all this weight. I look, not like myself.
Yeah.
But I could knit. So maybe I was trying to knit my world back together in some ways. But what it was very soothing. It was self-soothing. And the swishing sounds of the needles were what I needed to calm everything down, because I was in such a what do we call that? An autonomic
Fuse state?
something like that. I was just like, so yeah, I mean, and I could not have written those poems during that state. I could not have created art. I could knit. That was about what I could do.
Wynn has a question.
Okay.
It's in terms of some of what you were talking about, I spend these days, and I think it has a lot to do with where I am in my career. I spend about 8 to 10 hours each week with couples, primarily because one of them is dying of cancer, and others have just recently had a diagnosis of something that's going to kill and disable for a long period of time one of the partners. And one of the things that keeps coming up, that came up pretty early in the work, was the differences in the fear that a couple would show, and the empathic tension about understanding the other's fear, which involves, I think, part of what you've been talking about. The people I saw today, one of the themes that, and as he's been rehospitalized, has been, he's not afraid of being dying. He just wants to make sure everything is in order, that he can put things together as best he can. He's not afraid of dying. He doesn't understand his wife's issues. What she's afraid of is being in a world without him.
Right.
That difference between expecting to be absent versus having the loss of someone whose your world has just been so intertwined with, is a whole different kind of misery. And to have a couple look at this with each other's understanding seems to be a profoundly difficult thing that that I'm trying to figure out how to manage. But
yeah, good luck. Paul, was delusional.
Yeah.
He was not the version of Paul we all knew.
Well, and that's part of what has
So you
been-
don't even have the person you knew to go through that
Right.
practice with.
And the problem has been largely involved in when one person begins to recognize that other person's loss, and mostly, I'm thinking again, this particular couple, he's recognizing his deficiencies and is desperate to get things placed in order, and he's not going to. But she's terrified of having this gap in a world that has been so centered around his life. The first aid has been to quote something that Osorio was saying about what we should do as descriptive psychologists, his last kind of comment seemed to focus on do something else. The doing something else is a reconstruction or a new construction. But you've got to have, reason enough to try doing it. And in the midst of mourning the absence or the anticipating the horror, it's very hard to be anywhere except in the trauma. And it frightens the hell out of people in terms of recreating a key relationship, especially later in life. It's a funny place to be at my age with these people. But it's powerfully instructive. And I'm frequently lost.
I think being willing to sit and witness another's suffering is a capacity that can get developed, whether you, I don't think anybody ever signs up for that class. I didn't sign up for that class, but I will tell you that my ability to sit with suffering has deepened.
The expression
And
has been frequently employed, which is, I didn't sign up for this.
right.
Doesn't matter.
You didn't.
Yes,
Yeah.
I used to have, I want to just say one thing, like earlier in my career before the loss, like I'd get a lot of no-shows where people would stop seeing me, and I don't get those anymore. I wish I would get more.
Boring looks like. Boring. You got pressure. It's fine.
Okay, I also want to thank you for this. It was very powerful, meaningful. But it's very interesting to me because last year I gave a presentation on navigating the last chapters of life. And one of the things I mentioned was that I've noticed how many older people end up doing creative things, self-expressive things. It can be writing, it can be art, it can be a lot of different things, but it can be stained glass, it can be anything. But it fits very much with, I think what you're talking about in terms of, all of us are experiencing a lot of losses go along with getting older. Not only people, but diminished capacities in different ways, and some of the things that worked well don't work as well for us. And so I think there's several things about that need that we have, that creativity really, self-expression really fills. So for one thing, it creates a new sense of status, for us, a new identity. And, remember that, that Pete used to say, you don't have to do something well to have the identity. You can be a writer, even if you're not a good writer, it doesn't matter. What matters is you're a writer. It's not how well you do it, it's the identity that you have, or a poet, or whatever, photographer, whatever. But it's also it's like a self-status affirming thing to do. It's like, I have something worth expressing, worth saying to the world. Whether the world even ever sees it or not, I'm expressing something and it's meaningful to me. I have something in me that is worth expressing. So I think there's that. And then I don't know where this fits, but I was just remembering when my mother was dying. She got acute leukemia and was dying very quickly. I didn't think she was going to. I was really totally shocked when I found out that she just had, and actually by the time we knew for sure, it was like a week is all she had. And so I went on a long walk in the morning and just thinking and looking around and just trying to absorb that she was gonna die really soon. And I saw this mother and her little kid at a bus stop, and the kid was just, they were just fooling around and enjoying it. It was really so cool. And what I flashed on was the Jewish, our Jewish service book for Yom Kippur, which is the day of grieving. Well, part of it is atonement, but also grieving for losses. And one of the poems that was in our book was, if you were given a choice and you were told that you could live forever, but in order to have that, there would never be anything newborn. No new babies, no new birds, no new anything. Is there any doubt what we would choose? And I flashed on that when I saw that little kid with his mother, and I said, this is the cycle of life. I mean, I was very lucky because my mother, in a sense, lucky. My mother was 81. And I said, she's lived a good rich life. And so this is her time, and this is part of the cycle of life. And here's this little kid. And people have to die for little kids to be born, kind of. And it really was comforting. You know, it didn't stop me from grieving for my mother, but it was comforting.
Martin Smith has a question.
All right. No,
Was muted.
You have to unmute yourself.
You need to unmute, Mark.
Marty,
Yes,
you-
all right, am I unmuted? Yes, I have a green frame around my head, so I can see that I'm muted and green. That's good. This whole, I thank you, Charlie, for the presentation. It's profound, and for those of us who are older, and really older, and Carolyn, your words struck a lot of chords, and I don't have anything very logical to say except that, which is not except, it's not logical at all. At this point of life, you go beyond logic, you go beyond order and cause and effect and all that. You're in a whole new quantum, a whole new I don't know how to put it. You're in another territory. And you know, I find myself just trying to just sort of reach into and out of myself in terms of the essence of my humanity and maybe the essence of my eternity. And that's sort of the sense that I try to make of it all, but it's not logical, and it's not control. It's not any of that. You just kind of are in a whole new stratum. It's not even a stratum, it's beyond a stratum. So it's a hell of an amazing, it's a privilege to be here. And maybe this has to do with status and change and all that. I have no idea, but it's a privilege to be in this area, which almost feels cosmic, and mystical and terrifying at the same time. But thank you for bringing this whole topic to the fore, because every one of us is there or going to be there, and as human beings, and as parts of this cosmos, we will find our way and find our connection and find our place. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. It makes me think of a book that I read some years ago by Richard Rohr. I think he's a Franciscan monk. And he wrote a book called Falling Upward. And he just simplistically described what my simplistic saying, he was more nuanced, but just that the first half of life is establishing your powers and your ego, learning skills, learning, like finding your place in the world, a place where you can do things. And then the second half of life is more about entering into mystery or entering into a more soulful approach to life. So I don't know, that's sort of what I thought of when you were talking about that.
I just wanted to thank you for this. At one or two points, I almost had to leave the room, just cutting touch with my own grief and loss, but I'm sure all of us here have been through some of that.
Yeah.
And you just really touched me with that. Thank you.
Thanks for telling me.
And briefly, Joe's mention of our culture's excessive critical function. I know for me, one of the hardest things in a loss is just, did I do everything I possibly could? And the answer is no, I didn't do it perfectly. But that's been one of the hardest things. I know I'm not alone with that.
I've had to forgive myself. My son had a counselor during his illness, who I got kind of close to because we were colleagues too, but he was working with my son. And when I was down at the National Cancer Institute while my son was doing that cell replacement therapy, I wasn't fully present with him. I was disengaged.
Yeah.
It's almost like I couldn't bear all of it. And apparently my son lamented that with his therapist. And his therapist, I think this was a therapeutic mistake as a therapist, told me this
Yes.
afterwards, and it crushed me. It crushed me. I mean, I didn't even know how to respond, and that has stayed with me a long time. And the guilt and the shame of that, and wishing I could go back. The other thing I didn't tell you in the presentation is I was invited to do therapy with this new oncologist. The chief oncologist has a patient who's a 30-year-old man who has a very rare cancer and is probably not going to survive this cancer, and wanted a therapist. And so I agreed to meet with him. I go and sit with him in his hospital room. He's basically living in the hospital now. And I would never have been able to do that before, but there's something healing about it for me to be able to be present for this guy and to sit with him. I can't tell you how grateful I am, that the healing has happened in a profound way. Cause I was telling my mom, hey mom, I was telling what, mom? I don't want to be degraded in that relationship. I don't want her to feel degraded either. She was really sick. I don't know how you can do that. How can you go sit with this kid? And I said, I don't know. It just feels like an honor. It feels like a privilege to be able to sit with him. For him to let me into his world like that. He can't talk to his parents.
Right.
He can't. It's too painful for him. He sees the agony, and that's probably where I was. I know that's where I was, because I go out, they tell me, they say, we see it in your eyes, we see it in your eyes, we know, just seeing it in my eyes, and but when I see it in them, they're just like, they're like cats on a hot tin roof, they just cannot settle down. And the son knows this, and it's like, oh, it's like too much energy for him. So anyway, thanks for your comment.
Carolyn's side raised her.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I want to make a comment about his presentation and ways that we do them in the society. He did what Tom Mitchell's students did many years ago. Some of you were there. He told his students to write about a real problem in their life, and he would coach them through a descriptive understanding of it. And these, undergraduates came and told us, about the boyfriend who was killed in a motorcycle accident, the sister who was schizophrenic, and so forth. They were so real, so present, so engaged in the material. That's what we got from Charles today. And we need more of that in this group, to just be fully present in what's very real in our lives and use descriptive to get us through it. It's there for us.
Wow.
That's my end of my speech. I'll leave you alone now.
No, it's exactly consistent with the this vision of the period of spiritual development. But some years ago, I was finishing a lecture on Erik Erikson's final stages of wisdom, and an old guy came up to me at the end of class and said, "You know, when maybe, but as far as I can tell, it takes a licking, but it keeps on kicking." He corrected himself. He said, "No, it keeps on ticking." I said, "Either way."
It's 8 o'clock.
So,
Right.
can I'd like to say
One more.
Charlie, for you to be present in the way you could for your son is amazing.
Can you speak a little louder?
I said, for Charlie to be present for his son at that time in whatever way you could is amazing. And for him to be able to say to you, I need you to be present for me in the way that you can be.
Right.
And to do that in the way that it's a special thing, to do that. And I just, this was a great presentation.
We did have that talk before he died. You know, we were able to talk about it, so it was good.
But you let that happen.
Yeah.
And not a lot of people will allow that to happen. And not a lot of people can express that, you know, and we've all probably experienced, you know, death in that way where, you know, there will be, you know, my aunt who died alone and like, where are your kids? And you know, and other people who had people who accompanied them and comforted them during their passing. It's a real gift. And you've got it.
Thanks.
And you're spreading it.
I will receive that.
So. Okay,
Yeah, I'm done.
thank you, sir.